Ja, guten Tag und
Good afternoon. Welcome to our open forum session. We're going to deal with growth, economic growth, and the question of how much growth we need to be able to ensure that we have sustainability. And of course, the question is particularly topical and important at the moment because many people think that at the present time the situation isn't so good as regards growth. We don't know what the growth will be in 2008, and we have to think about sustainability and how we're going to deal with any growth which there is. We have a varied panel here. We have representatives from all the continents, and this, I'm sure, will give us a very diverse and very high-level discussion. Someone I don't need to present to you is Pascal Couchepin, Federal President of Switzerland this year, and it's a great honor to have Mr. Couchepin here with us. So welcome to Mr. Couchepin, and we have on his left the president of the we welcome you very much, madam. And on my left, Shannon Burrow from Australia. She's very much involved in the trade union movement. She's president of the Australian Council of Trade Unions, and also the president of the International Trade Union Confederation in Brussels. That means to say that she's in aeroplanes a great deal of the time between Australia and Geneva, where there's the International Labour Organization as well. Welcome, Mrs. Burrows. To my left, we have Mr. John Itty, Professor, School of People's Economics in Kerala, southern India. And he's well known as regards growth, and he is welcome on our panel today. The last person, Mr. Ricardo Hasman, has not been able to join us. He'll join us. I think he's in a traffic jam. He comes from Venezuela and represents Latin America. He's active in Boston at the John F. Kennedy School of Government, and is the director of the Epicenter for International Development. And he will speak to us about the two Americas. And we're very happy, as I said, to have Mrs. Onyuke, the Nigerian Stock Exchange Executive Director. Now then, we're looking at the question of growth this year, economic growth. This is an issue which is going to be at the center of our thinking and discussions. We've seen the crises which we've had, the turbulence on the economic markets, and I would like to ask the panelists how they see the development of the economy in 2008. Mr. Couchepin, perhaps you would like to start. First of all, I would like to thank you for the invitation. You've asked me to speak a foreign language, German, and I'm happy to do so. I think that this financial crisis will obviously have an effect on the economic situation in Switzerland. For years, we believed that the financial world could operate separately from normal economic growth, but we've seen that that is not the case. Financial developments obviously have an impact on the economy in general, and then secondly, we'll see whether what has been said over the last few years is correct. That is to say, it was said that thanks to the development of the former third world countries, things were going to change, that there were several motors, not only the motor which is America. Now we have China, South America, India, and we shall see whether or not there really are other motors which drive the economy, and whether globalization has gone so far that when one of the major motors or engines is weakened, this will have repercussions on the others. And I believe that I personally believe that all the other engines, motors, will have difficulties as well. There will be deficits and surpluses, and there will be obvious repercussions. Now then, we're speaking about growth rates in Switzerland. Mr. Couchepin, when I was Minister of the Economy, we always said that the growth rate in Switzerland was somewhere between 1.4 and 2.5% per year. Over and beyond that level, there are risks of inflation. And we managed to avoid inflation thanks to freedom of mobility. We've had a considerable number of workers who've come from other countries and come to work in Switzerland. And in the long term, the Swiss economy will not go up beyond 2.5. Yes, but the moderator says, well, will it go below? Well, it certainly shouldn't drop too far.
What do you
say below zero?
Crisis on Nigeria, the biggest country in Africa, and also on the African continent?
Well, in Nigeria and the rest of Africa, for example, we have not experienced the recent financial crisis that is global. If anything else, our own economy has been going up. The stock market has been booming, and I think we are benefiting from what is happening in the Western world. Most of the time is the other way around. The West is growing and Africa is not growing much in economic growth. But this time around, maybe because a lot of the markets, financial markets in the West, have been tumbling, portfolio managers and other investors now find the emerging markets of Africa very attractive. So we have been having a flourishing market, and the economic growth has been steadily growing over the past 2 years. So we have not really noticed the crisis. We only read about it in the newspapers and on television, but it's quite different from what is happening in Africa.
Mm-hmm. So in a way, you're really benefiting from the financial crisis. You're happy about it.
I believe so.
Okay. Let's come to Australia. I think it's more or less the same case like in Western Europe.
Well, let me start with a slightly more global perspective, because you can't disconnect the world. Pascal is right about that. In this instance, I think it's very different to the Asian financial crisis. And I want to talk about why it is and the impact on people. Last year, we warned the business community and the financial sector here in Davos that there was a huge discrepancy growing between the percentage of wages and relative to the national growth of economies, both in developed and developing countries. In fact, it's not often known, but in developing countries, the inequity has grown in terms of wages share of growth since the 1960s, almost, in a linear equation upwards with one or two peaks. In the Western world, the US is the best example, but it's everywhere for all of us as workers. In the US, for 3 decades, the relative real wage decline, that is the share of wages compared to national growth or profits, whichever indicator you take, has been growing like a set of alligator jaws opening up with wages on the bottom rung. What therefore happened when the subprime crisis occurred in the US, and it's still washing through, of course, we are probably a third, maybe a half of the way through, is that poorer working people couldn't pay their mortgages. They couldn't pay their mortgages because they weren't earning enough money, and the financial market sold them packets of credit that in fact they always knew was a risk, but because they bundled it up and it got a AAA rating because there is no regulation for the non-bank financial sector, it's then passed off to a bank who buys the package all tied up with a pretty bow and a AAA rating. That's then offset in risk terms to other financial institutions, and so we have in fact a global environment where all of this is linked to the same pool of money one way or another. The pressures, though, that are now really difficult for working families, particularly in Europe and in Australia, is that we have this complex beast. In the US, the Reserve has cut the rates by 0.75%, and there's forecast for another serious rate cut potentially. In Australia, we're still experiencing inflationary pressures, and so because the central bank has only one job, to use their capacity for constraint with interest rates to moderate inflation, then they're talking about, as indeed the central banks in Europe still, putting up rates. That means that there's another whammy, a triple whammy on working people. They couldn't afford to pay their mortgages. The relative stress of that is serious. We've had serious numbers of rate rises already. Now another one, but the third piece will still wash through, and that is as the crisis in the US continues, because people were given a subsidy to get them to buy this product, and that will be reset and they'll pay higher rates over the next few months, and so the sad cycle continues. So the thing that we need to do is go back to heed those warnings. We must have greater equity between the share of wages and the share of profits, because while governments will need to bail out, and they are doing so in order to get stability, bail out some of the if we don't have sustainability, which means a capacity for working people to make ends meet, then small businesses suffer because you can't pay your bills. Medium enterprises suffer. You can't invest in the things that matter to you, whether it's a gift for somebody or that special treat in your community by way of a special dinner, or whether it's investing in your own home. So business loses and workers lose. And my final point is that if governments who've been asleep at the wheel don't recognise that we need some regulation, not even about re-regulation, although that's would be a nice discussion, there is no regulation for some of these financial instruments. And unless the government realises that some regulation is necessary, that the central banks are limited with a fairly blunt instrument, and unless they extract a contract from the world of business and finance that says we must have social cohesion, so we need some more money in social safety nets, and we must have fair wages, and that means the right to bargain collectively with a floor of appropriate entitlements, then we will see this cycle continue. The timing will be in the hands of the market, but working people will continue to suffer the stress of exceptional credit burden, and all due to a lack of capacity to pay their bills because the wages share keeps declining relative to growth. We must have a better way.
Let's move on to Mr. Iti. India is the growth story of the last years. We have still about 8%. Do you see any major impact on this growth story through this financial crisis?
Yeah, it is true that the growth rate in India is high, 8% for the last 3-4 years. But there are many studies recently that shows that the growth rate should be evaluated not for 1 or 2 years, it should be evaluated for 15 to 20 years. And there are certain studies that shows that evaluated the growth rate for the last 20 years and 25 years, and there shows that there is only slight improvement in the present growth rate. That is, but unfortunately, these studies are not being brought by the mainstream media.
Yeah, but let's talk about the financial crisis first, and we can talk about the growth definition later. But just to have a short overview, what do you see now? I mean, is this going to go on, or
now it is true that the growth rate is high, but the impact of growth rate on the welfare of the people is a different story. For example, along with the high growth rate, the number of poor, absolute number of the poor, the number of unemployed, the number of child labor, the number of casual workers, malnourished children, and of course suicide is increasing. When we come specifically to the case of suicide, for the last 7 years, 150,000 people, farmers committed suicide. This is unheard in the history of India. This is considered as the direct result of the type of growth process we are having. Then another problem is that from 1947 to 2000, the type of economic growth created 60 million, we call them development refugees. That is, people are displaced. People are deprived of their life and livelihood. deprived of land and water, forest, for the sake of economic growth. This is another very evident impact, and therefore there is a very people's movements against this type of development process, especially special economic zones. Recently, one provincial ministry passed a resolution against allowing more special economic zones for speedy economic growth, because they have realized the problems of displacement of workers from land and water, life and livelihood. Then another example is that during 1926, during 2006, despite the high growth rate, our Human Development Index, the ranking of India was 126. And within 1 year, the ranking has went down by 2 points. Now it is 128. So this is the type of growth paradox we are facing.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. We now may move over to Mr. Hausmann. Welcome. And we would like to share your view with us. What's first the point, Latin America, how is it affected by the financial crisis? And of course, you know, the northern part of the continent is very well as indeed. So what's your view on that one?
Well, I must say that as a Latin American, I have gone through many recessions, many crises, sometimes very painful. Sometimes economies actually need adjustment because they have undergone an unsustainable path. And adjustment is painful, but it's sometimes inevitable. Now, the last 5 years of the global economy has been the fastest growth the world has ever known. Okay? It's been the fastest growth the world has ever known, and we should greet that at least with some recognition that, you know, many people have found increased livelihoods and employment and unemployment rates have been coming down. Millions of people have been incorporated to the global market. So that's the situation we inherit. Now, in that period, I would think that growth has been caused by the fact that, you know, technology has been evolving very quickly. Cell phones have been making a lot of people access a bunch of stuff, the internet, and all of this stuff. But there were two important disequilibria in this pattern of growth. And that is that the American consumer was consuming too much, and in my view, the Chinese consumer is consuming too little. Mm-hmm. China has a savings rate well above 50% of national income. Now, these people have only one child, and they're growing at 9%, and they're saving so much. How much money do they want to give their children? Right? Why don't they consume part of it themselves?
But that may start soon.
And in fact, so the nation as a whole has they have the highest investment rate in the world, China, and in spite of that, they have excess savings equivalent to 12% of GDP. Mm. So I think part of what the world needs is for the Chinese consumer to play a bigger role, and for Chinese income levels to go up. That's part of what the world needs.
But coming back to the question, do you see any serious recession now in Latin America and Northern America?
I'll go to Latin America in a little second. The U.S. consumer needs to consume less. It has been consuming too much, borrowing too much, and the source of the crisis is that the U.S. consumer cannot pay its debts. That is the origin of the financial crisis. That the American consumer borrowed too much and now cannot pay his debts. So inevitably, the adjustment process must involve the American consumer to consume less, right? Maybe not overshooting too much, but it needs to consume less. And that inevitably involves slower growth in the U.S. Inevitably involves slower growth in the U.S.
But slower growth means negative growth, which is a definition of recession.
Yeah, and sometimes adjustment involves a period of negative growth, and we should not get scared of it. I mean, the sins were committed in the past. Now, going forward, maybe the best path going forward is having a year of negative growth. I have gone through many years of negative growth, and I survived. And you know, so in the country, the richest country in the world, if it goes through 1 year of negative growth, you know, it will survive too. It's not the end of the world. It's not the end of the world. It is the end of the world if you're in a bank and you've lent all this money, you don't want to lose your capital, so you want to be bailed out by extremely low interest rates, and so on and so forth. I can see the people who are going to lose the money, but I'm not so sure how much of that money is going to be lost by the workers, and how much money is it going to be lost by the financial system. UBS lost, I don't know how many billions of dollars. In no time, they raised $50 billion that were willing to recapitalize the bank.
The people from Asia, you were mentioned, who are not spending.
So Latin America right now has a current account surplus, so they're not borrowing from the rest of the world. They're enjoying a period of high, maybe even too high terms of trade. The price of commodities have been very high. So in general, I would say that the region is well poised to undergo a period of slow growth in the U.S. Latin America has also seen very high rates of growth over the last 5 years without these imbalances. So I would say Latin America is well poised to survive a U.S. recession. What I think is a mistake, because we don't want just to think of 2008, we have our whole lives ahead of us. What we want is a healthy, robust, growing American economy over the longer term. And this idea of obsessing ourselves with 1 year of negative growth and doing crazy things to avoid 1 year of negative growth, instead of thinking of a healthy U.S. economy for the long run, that is going to be a good partner for the rest of the world, I think is a mistake. So I would say Latin America will survive a U.S. recession, okay? And we should not distract the attention of policymakers from the needed adjustment in the U.S., and we should stop this scaremongering of saying, if the U.S. goes into a recession, the whole world will come down crashing, so do anything and everything to prevent 1 year of negative growth in the U.S. I think that's the wrong way to frame the issues.
Mr. President, if we have 1 year of negative growth in the U.S., do you have negative growth in Switzerland as well?
Well, first of all, I would like to say that I share the view of Mr. Haussmann that it is not a catastrophe. It is a catastrophe for the individuals, because you must not forget that when there is a recession, some people have many more problems, and it is social problems too. I remind you that Switzerland, at the beginning of the 90s, has a mortgage crisis, and the Swiss banks lost at the time between 30 and 40 billion US dollars. It is double more than the loss because of the Americans' subprime crisis, which is unpleasant. We lost because of the Americans. Last time we lost because of us ourselves. It is a difference. We pay for the Americans' exuberance. But the problem is, when I started, I said we shall see if the plane has now 2 or 3 motors. Before there was only a motor. The problem is to know how is it possible to shift the burden of bringing in the air the plane. How is it possible to shift it from the Americans to other countries? And is it possible to increase the consumption in China so quickly and so much that it can replace the American exaggerated consumption? Because in China, most of the expenses are done by the government, infrastructure. Is it possible to go on like that? The individuals in China are not in the situation to spend very much more, except on the shore, at the seashore, inside. They have no money to spend. Yeah, how can they spend more?
Okay, thank you very much. I just want to come back to Ms. Okereke. We were hearing a lot about the negative side of economic growth. Mr. Eti mentioned a lot of cases in India, even the high. Let's just go back to Ms. Okereke. How do you face this in Nigeria? I mean, your growth rates are pretty impressive as well, but there's always a flip side to this coin, and I think a lot of people, especially in the countryside, are suffering from this growth you have.
Yes, indeed. In Nigeria and most of Africa, we are trying to sustain that growth, because that's the only way that Africa can survive. And any opportunity to increase the growth and sustain it is the most important thing. It's a little easier to actually get the growth, but then to sustain it. In the case of Nigeria, we are finding it a little difficult to sustain, because we have a country that have 50% of the people are Christians and 50% are Muslims. And the government came up with a policy that nobody should have more than 4 children. No family should have, a couple should not have more than 4 children. In the southern part of Nigeria, we are keeping to that, and because people have realized that you have more money to spend if you have less children, and you can afford to educate them and also spend on them. But our brothers from the northern part of Nigeria have translated that policy to mean that as a Muslim, you are not supposed to have more than 4 children with 1 wife. And so they have 4 wives. So they multiply 4 by 4, and they come up with 16 children. And they think that's a lot of development, because in the past they used to have up to 20 or 30 children. So they think 16 is okay. But we don't think it's okay. So whatever growth we are achieving in the southern part of Nigeria is neutralized by the northern part, because the infrastructure cannot cope. And so there's very little infrastructural development. So the government has to spend more money to provide infrastructure to the population. But on the other, the flip a coin of it is that when you have such a large population, you also have consumption. And we do not want to be senseless, like Americans. I said senseless spending, as Professor Hausman said that yesterday, that Americans buy what they don't need. They just buy what they want. They have overspent money. So we don't want to follow the same pattern in Nigeria, because to spread development and economic growth nationwide is more paramount to us, so that we don't have a section of the people progressing and sustaining the development, and then the other section is going backwards and don't have enough to eat and enough water or electricity. So it has to be a general growth that can be sustained, and we believe that with less population we can sustain that growth and economic development. In other parts of, especially the western sub-Saharan Africa, that growth is also being sustained, but development is not coming as fast as we want it to, because a lot of people from the West still believe that there's not much opportunities in Africa. But I seize the opportunity to let you know that there's a lot of opportunities, investment opportunities, that have not been tapped in Africa. So it's those people that are investing know that the green pastures now reside in Africa. And that is why as we are having global financial crisis in the West, a lot of sensible people now realize that they can go to Africa, help to tap the opportunities that are available, and then they make money. So the world goes, it goes around that way. So for us, it's a good thing that there may be a recession in the Western world, especially in America. But we're not bothered, too much about it, because I believe that the American economy is highly structured, and they can sustain the recession for just a short period. So we have to make haste and benefit a little from this recession or slow growth, so that we can take a better advantage to sustain the little growth we have made now, to sustain it for a longer period, because we cannot afford to have a recession.
Okay, thank you. I just want to go back to India, Mr. Itti. As I already said, from Europe, from the US, India is admired for its growth story, but if I understand you right, you're quite critical about the policy of the Indian government, that this is too much focused on growth. What would be your recipe? How should the Indian government deal with this problem that a lot of poverty is also created by this very strong growth boom?
Before directly answering this question, I think we have to understand the hidden story of the growth calculation. Because growth calculation is, there are a lot of fallacies. I will cite 1 or 2 examples only. One, if natural calamities occurs, economic growth increases. because what is destroyed by nature is not deducted in the calculation. But at the same time, the new constructions is considered as addition to economic growth. When the economy gets monetized, economic growth increases in terms of money value of goods and services. But people's welfare was more when traditional relations in society was better. When monetization comes, the relations in society disrupts. The welfare and well-being of the people is largely based on the social relations, the family relations, the neighborhood relations and things like that. But the growth, measurement of growth, ignores such things. By ignoring such things, another example I will show. There are a lot of, but because of time I will say only. When husband and wife quarrel each other, they go to divorce cases. When more divorce cases occurs, growth increases because the services produced by the barristers increases, so growth is calculated like that. There are a lot of things like that. Dozens of such fallacies are there. So what I am saying is that the very calculation of growth and the hidden things in that is to be questioned. One of the economists, Indian economists, economics is not merely about people and commodities. It is more about relations. The major thing is that the relations is important to promote welfare in society. This aspect is completely rejected because of the type of growth process. That is why the government also, but the government is now more influenced by the financial aspect to show the people and the other nations and the investors that we are having more growth, so come and invest here. But the people's problems are being neglected. But the people responded to this approach of the government in the last two parliamentary elections. The two governments, previous governments, they raised the banner of India shining, showing that higher growth rate, but people refused to vote for the two governments. So that really shows the difference between the money economy and the real economy. This is the problem. The growth rate shows only some indicators about the money economy, but the real economy is important, which is about the daily life of the people, their life and livelihood. This is the crucial issue that we are neglecting.
Okay. Coming to the people, Ms. Burrow, there's always, when we talk about growth, there is this word of jobless growth. That means we have good growth rates, but the people don't get jobs, they don't get the benefit out of this growth. How do you see this problem? I think that's mostly a problem in the developed world.
It's mostly a problem through the developed and the developing world in terms of jobless growth, but it's a major problem in terms of the quality of jobs in developing countries. We are seeing, in fact, not just a sustained unemployment rate on the formal scale of some 200 million, an underemployment rate probably 5 times that. But if I can give you a sense of linking the two, 5 years ago, I think now 4 years ago, we said to this forum in Davos that on the ILO figures we needed to generate 500 million jobs within the decade to actually affect real growth in terms of the capacity of people to improve their lives. And it was around the time that the UN system declared that the Washington Consensus or trickle-down theory had failed in large measure. If you take last year, the IMF's forecast for growth was 4.9%. They shaved 0.1% off that in around November, and that's before this slump. So that was already a conservative readjustment. That 0.1% actually lost us the potential for 40 million jobs. And of the 40-odd million jobs created last year, which we were initially enthusiastic about, thinking we were starting to make some headway, then if you look at the quality of those jobs, less than half of them were jobs that any of us would do, because less than half of them had any form of security, let alone any amount of income that could sustain a dignified existence or have a capacity to raise a family on. So the actual amount of people who are living in dire straits, that's on less than $2 a day, the actual number of people in the globe, despite all the growth, is increasing. And can I just finally say to Ricardo and Pascal, it is my job to worry about the impact of the financial crisis on the people. And while you're right, the economic world will go on. Ironically, in good socialist tradition, the markets will ask that the people's taxes bail out the worst of the instability. It's a sad irony at one level that all these wealthy financial institutions still rely on people's savings. And ironically, a lot of that bailout will come from the savings of China and India through sovereign wealth funds. Some dangers in that because of lack of transparency. China could buy and sell the deficit of the US, for example. That's got its own inherent sort of threats. But nevertheless, we're now seeing a world where the profit take is so great and so greedy that the stability is put at risk, and we're seeing that right now. And who bails out these institutions but the hard-earned national savings of working people through, in the case of China, sovereign wealth funds, in the case of other countries, our tax base. So it is such a complex issue that I come back to say, unless there's greater share of growth for working people to sustain security and grow the livelihoods and the opportunities for unemployed people, and unless we can see governments look at appropriate regulation, the cowboy attitude of the financial markets will continue. And why should that be so?
Mr. Kuschba, now the President would like to give you the word about what she said and also about the prospect of jobless growth in Switzerland. I think it's also a problem we have here.
I listened attentively to the speeches of my two friends on the left side, and I would like to ask them, what do you prefer, growth or no growth? And nobody would prefer no growth and recession, because we have problem when there is growth, but there is less problem when we have growth than when we have recession. When we have growth, we have at least something to share. When we have recession,
I'm not arguing that.
And you speak of stability. Stability is death. There is the only place where you are really stable is when you are dead. When you are living, you move.
Yes.
And if you move, you can fall.
Yes.
And if you move, you can win, but you can also fall. And our system, economic system, makes excesses. It is true, but we pay for that. And do you think that the governments, I am a member of the government, do you think that the government will be able to avoid an accident as it happened 2 days ago in a French bank? The French bank was unable to know exactly what happens in the banks. It is a problem for the surveillance. But do you think that the government will be able to say, bankers, do that and that and that, and we shall have growth with constant stability in the growth without accident? All history shows that, as a professor said, there are excesses. And what are excesses? Setback. But excesses are also events who help to create a new economy. You speak of jobless growth. I should like to discuss about that.
Go ahead.
Probably there is many chances that you have more jobs when there is growth. And it can happen when a society is blocked by regulation. Then there is, during a certain time, jobless growth. But it is artificial, and all of a sudden it comes down. I think in a free economy, not totally free, you must have a regulation to avoid criminal activities and so on. In a free society, you have many more chances to create jobs than in a society of stability. I listen to you, and I stop now. I listen to you. What do you want? Naturally, it is true, and when there is growth, that there is disruption of traditional way of living. There is disruption of values that I appreciate. But if we want to bring to people health, it means that people will live longer, that more children will be able to survive. We shall have to do more an economy in which there is movement, more jobs and growth.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Hausmann, you just want to comment on that?
Yeah, well, I think we're having an interesting debate between us, and I am from Latin America. I'm from Venezuela. I've worked on Latin America and all the countries in Latin America, but I've also worked on India. And as a Latin American, I face the following problem. I measure growth in terms of the growth of good, productive jobs. That's what we really want, right? To create sustainable livelihoods for people, right? So now, sometimes we have growth because we dig some holes in the Andean mountains, or we dig some holes on the ground and we take stuff out. 2 people get employed, and so on. That counts as growth, but nobody seals the spillovers, right? But there are other times where you get growth because you connect people's willingness to create with markets in the world. So, for example, in India now you have this incredible expansion of business process outsourcing, of call centers, of back offices, and so on. So there are people who are moving thousands and thousands of jobs to India because they can be connected through the internet and so on, through phone lines, and you get these people getting decent jobs, decent incomes, because they are now connected to the global economy. We try to emulate India and to learn from the capacity to integrate millions of people to the global economy through their work. And many countries are trying to follow these kinds of strategies of, I would say that the most difficult thing to achieve development is to achieve mechanisms through which you integrate your labor force to the opportunities that the world has to offer. Now, if I can say one more thing about India. I worked in the poorest state of India, the state of Bihar, a couple of summers ago. And it was very clear to me that the only way India is going to progress is if it's going to generate jobs that are not dependent on land. Because everybody in India is working with ridiculously small plots of land. The land per worker in agriculture is minimal, and they're already working at incredibly high productivities, and they're generating these very, very low incomes. So what you need in India is urban infrastructure, urban activities that is going to take workers off the land and integrate them to the rest of the Indian economy and to the global economy. And I cannot see a way forward for India to have incomes not of $1,000 per capita, but hopefully of $10,000 per capita in the next generation, unless it does that. I can see no way for India to progress in terms of sustainable livelihoods unless it moves in that direction.
But we want to talk about sustainability, and I think the challenge for a government must be to have economic growth and to promote sustainable mechanisms. And the problem is that sometimes government don't care about it, and that the cowboy capitalism Ms. mentioned may be against it. So what can governments do to promote these kind of tools, to promote, for example, environmental friendly products, to be innovative in areas which are very good for sustainability in the long run? Would take that question.
Let me intervene into those issue about the job plus growth and India.
Yeah, but let's talk about this question now. How can we put together sustainability and economic growth, also by really looking at concrete products? How can we promote this? I mean, we have a big debate about climate change, about environments, and the question is, and there may be even a lot of comparative advantages in countries which do specialize on these kind of things, in the automotive industry, for example. So what can governments do, Mr.?
We think they can do a lot. We are advocates of growth. We want growth, but we want decent work to underpin it. And green jobs are part of the future. There's no question about that. As a population, the people are smarter than, or faster, I think, and smarter than many governments, because they know that we have to protect our planet for our children and our grandchildren. But we reject the notion that doing something about climate change actually imperils economic futures, because if you just have a look at the forecast that a report that will come out between the UN EP and in fact the global labour movement, we suggest that if you take the alternate energy area, and there's lots of other areas to take, but if you just look at alternate energy futures, then we could see as high as 2.1 million jobs in wind energy, 6.3 million in solar by 2030. and the order of 12 million in biofuels through related agriculture in India, which I agree with Ricardo. We have to look at how you sustain agriculture, because there's food security issues as well as, of course, the biofuels demand. So we're very optimistic about green jobs, but it will require governments to have courage, because you can't just leave it to the market and you can't just leave it to government. There is always a nice imbalance. And if I can just finish by saying to Pascal, what I reject is not growth. We want growth. I reject a notion that when the economy is growing at full steam, the corporate sector can say to the workers, oh, to keep growing, your wages have to keep going down, you have to work longer hours. And then when the casino capitalism actually loses on the stock market, they say to the workers, oh, we're in trouble, you can't have wage increases that will create inflation. Somewhere in the mix, the people who create the wealth have to be protected with rights to social safety nets and rights to collectively bargain. Because when you have collective bargaining coverage, when we can bargain for green jobs, for decent work, for a fair share of the wages, then we get some of that stability that actually underpins a future for the market to survive.
Mr. Kushman, just on the question, I mean, does the government have the duty to give special tax incentives, for example, to promote sustainable products? So, what would be the role of the government in a market economy?
Well, it is probably very different from one country to the other. And first of all, I would like to say that I am very happy that we share a common view that growth is necessary. I share also the view that it is necessary as there is social debate between trade union and employers to share the fruits of growth. It depends on the country, which regards the sustainability. For me, a great experience was a visit in Mongolia in the spring. Mongolia is a very rich country which regards mining, and they've given licenses to various companies in the world. And the companies they most appreciate are the private companies, not the companies owned by neighboring states. Because a great big Canadian company is always afraid of an international campaign if they do not respect the environmental necessities. And we visited one of them. It was not perfect, but almost perfect. On the other side, they say when state companies owned by neighboring states come and if they do not respect the environmental necessities, as soon as we start protesting, they say it is a political issue, you aggress the government off or the government off. When it is private companies with stock exchange, if there is a campaign, the value of shares go down. Okay, and they say, in this case, they prefer to have private companies rather than state companies because it is less political. Sure, in our country, it is absolutely sure that we cannot have growth without respect for the environment.
Okay, but let's come.
I am against subsidies.
You're the president now, and you're heading the Federal Council. But the question is, what can the government do to promote sustainability as far as products are concerned? Can you do anything at all, or do you just leave it to the market?
We can have standards. We can have indications of the environmental friendly products. But I am against subsidies. We have had a good experience or a bad experience with agriculture in Switzerland. I do not want to create a new agricultural policy with subsidies for the industries who are environmentally friendly. We can do that without subsidies,
but you can have tax
building
incentives.
A bureaucracy.
Tax incentives you can
Why
have.
not? Sure. To improve buildings, to adapt them, sure, we can do that, but not subsidies. Exceptionally from time to time. You mustn't not to be you mustn't to be fanatics, but generally speaking, taking money from the citizen and giving back through the state is never a good solution.
Okay, Mr. Hausmann on that one.
Let me, you see, fish don't know they are in water. They take water for granted. You have to be outside of water to understand water. So when you live in a completely developed society where there's a bunch of institutions and services the government is already providing, you don't see it. You take it for granted. So when you go to a developing country and you ask, okay, suppose I'm going to integrate this country to the rest of the world. And I'll tell you about an experience I had in Peru. So, you know, they suddenly come up with the idea, why don't we export fresh asparagus? Well, to export fresh asparagus, you need phytosanitary permits. You need to get through the ports and customs quickly before they rot. You need a cold storage transport system. There is no way a farmer can decide on these things. Either the government provides the things that it has taken under its responsibility, or there can be no economic activity. This implies no subsidy. This implies just the government doing its role in the productive process that we always forget. So Switzerland has a tourism industry. Well, there are airports, people go through immigration and customs and so on. There's security so that tourists don't think that they're going to be attacked. There's a set of things that governments provide. It is, in a poor country, the governments are very limited, so they can provide few things. It's very important that there is very deep interaction between private activity, between social entrepreneurs and economic entrepreneurs and the government, to see how these few resources that governments have can most easily facilitate economic activity, because economic activity is always underpinned under some type of arrangement, atmosphere, infrastructure, rules, settings that the government provides.
But that doesn't, I mean, in any case, you need some regulation, I think, in some cases. If you look at the cars, for example, the pollution, you have the carbon dioxide, you cannot solve this problem without good regulation, and you have regulation in the US as well in this case.
But the regulation is sometimes, the regulation is what people want, and it's what enterprises want. So suppose you have an airline. You want to tell your customers that the airplanes are safe. But the president of the company can say, my airplanes are safe, but who's going to believe him? But if there's a government agency whose responsibility is to make sure that the airplanes are safe, and they say that they're safe, then the customers will get on the plane. So regulation is part of establishing trust between people and society. They involve the government because that's what we have governments for. We delegate on government the enforcement of our agreements as citizens of a society. So regulation is the normal thing that happens in a society. We put money in the bank because there's a regulator that says that the banks are safe. We eat the food because there's a regulator that says that the food is safe. So we need governments to create the trust that markets need to operate.
Okay, but the question is, do we need more regulation to have more sustainability?
We need good regulation, the necessary regulation, the one that will be required.
And who's the final judge on that, the government or the market economy? Whether the regulation is good or not?
I think it's the society. You see, we have to understand we are democracies, or we want to be democracies. We are a society. We delegate on government functions. They are our representatives. They are not a Martian outside of the world. They do what we want them to do.
I cannot disagree.
Sure.
The people that come from this part of the world, you can say your government should do this and government should do that. And I believe that the governments of the Western world have done more than they can do. We in the imagined parts of the world, especially in Africa, we don't believe in our government. We don't want government to do anything because government officials are the worst set of workers you can ever find. Okay, so we don't believe government. We don't want government to do anything. You take, for example, in Nigeria, we rely more on the oil companies than from the government, because the oil companies give money to government as tax. The government is supposed to use that money to provide social benefits for the citizens. But government officials spend the money, and then they take the money and put in banks in London and in Switzerland, in Swiss bank accounts.
Well, that's good.
Okay, and they don't tell their wives. They die, the money goes. So we don't believe at all in government, and we don't want government to bring any regulation. What we do is how we sustain development in Nigeria is through the private sector. And we in the stock exchange, all the companies that are quoted on the stock exchange, we supervise them effectively. The government does not supervise anybody. There's a lot of corruption in every society, but it's more outstanding in the developing countries. So that even when there is a problem with, you say here that if the Swiss government tells you that airplane is safe, you are comfortable to fly in it. In Nigeria, if the government tells me that plane is safe, I go the other way. Because somebody can give money to the government inspector. And because government does not police its workers, that official will accept money and declare the plane safe. So it's the other way around. If somebody from the organized private sector tells you that the plane is safe, you believe. So it will take a long time to say that government in the developing world can bring in regulation and bring amenities, social amenities to the poor people. It is the organized private sector that does that in the developing economies all over Africa. Even in South Africa, the government does not play as much role. South Africa is one of the most developed, it is the most developed country in Africa, followed by Egypt and Nigeria and Mauritius, Tunisia and Morocco and so on. But people rely more on the organized private sector than the government. So, but in the Western world, for example, I feel comfortable sitting next to the president of Switzerland. But I tell you, I may not feel so comfortable sitting next to a president from Africa. Because the people that want to hit him could make a mistake and hit me.
Okay.
So, honestly.
No, thank you very much. Maybe we just now have a nice point to give you the opportunity to ask questions, I think. We have 2 microphones. And who wants to start? The gentleman there on my left hand. Yeah.
I'm a teacher at the International School of Geneva. My question is for Mr. Hausman. You've traveled all over Latin America and Asia. So have I. And I've noticed from Dhaka to Manila to Mumbai, all the cities are a mess. You know, there's huge consumption, there's flyovers going on everywhere, there's a huge number of cars. Mumbai has a population of 30 million. The local trains take on shift in people of about 7 million, which is more than the population of Switzerland. And you are talking about urbanization as the only solution for India.
Yeah.
I beg to differ. This is the worst solution for India.
Yeah.
What are your views?
You're right.
Well, let me tell you, India has a rate of urbanization of 30%. So 70% of the people live in rural areas. We don't know of any country with an income per capita of $10,000 or $20,000 dollars per year that has a rate of urbanization below 80%. So I cannot imagine a prosperous India unless a large proportion of the people currently living in rural areas urbanize. That does not mean that they have to go to Bombay or Calcutta and so on. I think that the most important decision for India going forward is what is going to be the structure of its cities. If you go to a country like Germany, there are no large cities in Germany. There are no large cities. By Latin American standards, Berlin is a small city and Frankfurt is a village. So, but it has its population very well dispersed in many small and medium-sized cities. That is a strategic decision that India has to take going forward. Now, I'll tell you one political problem that India faces. I think that the opportunities for growth in India are in urban areas. And investment will have to go to new cities where the population can migrate so that they free up land so that fewer people can work with more land, and that is also going to increase the income in rural areas. The political problem is the following, that investments have to go to urban areas to attract people, but voters are in rural areas. So that's why, as a discussion from India was saying, that people in rural areas vote against the governments that are investing in urban areas because they are not living there. And that's a major political challenge for India going forward. But I think that the role for India is to have the kinds of small and medium-sized cities that people will find attractive, clean, and nice to live, and instead of dodging the question of what kind of urbanization they'll have, and people migrating in a disorderly fashion to Mumbai and Calcutta and so on.
Thanks. Next question, please.
I have to disagree with that.
short intervention on that?
I have to disagree with that, basically, his position.
Okay. Okay. There on the right-hand side, just...
Professor Hausman, I was wondering if you could respond to the limits to growth thesis. There's a very big conversation in the younger generation that globalization and growth in general is running up against severe ecological limits. And I know that you have views about that. Could you share them?
Well, I think that the most important thing is for those ecological limits to become obvious in prices in the market, so that we get our scientists, our technologists, our developers to be able to find cleaner ways of doing things. If we do not make the costs of environmental damage obvious to the consumer and to the producer, then there's no reason to adjust and change. And I honestly am an optimist about the capabilities of science and technologies to solve many of our problems. I come from Latin America. It's much poorer than Europe. It's much dirtier than Europe. Europe is cleaner every time. They've cleaned up a lot of problems. We're dirtying many problems because we don't have the income and the resources. But I think that over time, the more, for example, if we make carbon taxes an issue, the technology will respond and we will have cleaner energy technologies. If we make water scarcity a price, we will find ways, cleaner ways to conserve water and to have cleaner and better water and more sustainable water. So I think that we have to believe in human ingenuity. It's gotten us this far. And I think that we need to organize society so that as we face these problems, we find humans that are actually solving them.
Thank you.
I think that the unrealistic part of that question is, can you stop growth? And our view is that you can't. Look at the populations of Africa, India, China. You know, they constantly want to have a decent living standard, and that's their right, just as it is for people in our countries. And so you do have to do what Professor Hausman says and actually find the solutions. But we have to make sure that the future is in fact green growth, that we are growing in a way that isn't further damaging the economy. And that's where the people of the world will have to demand of their governments that they take seriously the ecological challenges. And to the extent that you look at China, I was staggered when I read these figures that show that China says that they can actually, that by 2020 they can reduce energy uses by as much as 65% using existing technology, just transforming existing buildings into energy-saving buildings. So 65% in the construction sector alone, that's enormous. That's existing technology. So we must demand that governments use what exists and invest in the future, as the professor says, because I just think to have a debate about stopping or limiting growth is unrealistic given the current state of development in the world.
Thank you. Next question, please. The gentleman over fourth row.
I just have a question for Mr. Hausman. And you mentioned several times about that. Is that possible for Chinese people to consume more to save the world? But I just tell you that for Chinese government, they have already consumed too much. But for the ordinary people in China, they don't have so much power or so much capital or money to spend, because the saving number you see from the banking system from China is not the real saving number. We just call it, a lot of them, they are the black ones or the gray ones from some small business or the corruption from the government officials. They are not belonging to the ordinary people, so you cannot expect them to spend that money because it's not their money. And the second point that you also mentioned that is that possible for China, maybe Mr. Cushman mentioned that, is that possible for China to be the another motor for the world economy airplane? But I said it's not possible because we just get too low profits or wages in the whole production, the chain in the world. We just got very little margin from the whole. So it's not possible. And we already pay too much for the for the environment pollution and too much for the deterioration. And China is also a country very limited in its natural resources. And I just give you a number that even with the construction of the Three Gorges Dam, this is one of the largest the water dam in the world. But in this winter and autumn, China, in the central China provinces, they suffered the largest, the power off in history, maybe in 10 years, in the last 10 years. It's never imagined before we celebrate the Three Gorges Dam.
Okay,
and
Mr. Hausmann.
Another number is that already 10,000 small enterprises in the southern China, in Guangdong province or in Hong Kong, already closed for the increasing prices of the energy and of the wages. So I expect that more will be closed.
Thank you, Mr. Hausmann. Then Mr. Kushman.
Well, I also worked on China, and I have a report on China on my website, and I loved my experience in China. If I were a Chinese policymaker, I would do policies only for the benefit of the Chinese people. So what I'm saying is not that China has to do something for the benefit of the world, only for the benefit of the Chinese people. Now, the Chinese people own the state, and there are many state-owned enterprises in China that are making very high profits. Now, the managers of these state-owned enterprises think that they own the enterprises. Those enterprises are, in theory, owned by the people. So I proposed that all state-owned enterprises distribute a minimum dividend to the government. Now, China is focused on the notion of harmony, social harmony, regional harmony, environmental harmony. I suggest that this money is used for those purposes, that it is spent on the less advantaged, that is spent on the backward regions, that it's spent on environmental preservation. Now, on top of that, China is buying a lot of U.S. government debt that is funding American deficits. I think that Chinese should use that money to invest more in China, or to transfer more money in China. So we proposed, and actually the government followed up, stop asking people to pay for education. Have free education. You should give people access to medical services. They used to be provided in rural areas by communes. Now the communes don't exist anymore. There's insufficient provision of health services. So you can transfer the money to the people so that the people have generated the income. It is their income. Give it back. Give it back. Let them enjoy more of the fabulous growth that has happened. And I think that will be good for China. It will be more balanced growth for China, and it will be good for the world.
Thank you, Mr. Kushman. On your view to China, nothing to add.
You know, when you are responsible for a country of 7 million inhabitants, you don't give advice to people who have to govern a country of 1 and 300 billion inhabitants. You observe, you listen to the professors and to the people, and you try to understand.
I admire your humility. Ich wollte nur mal sagen, Sie können die Fragen auch sehr gerne.
You can also put the questions in German if you want to put questions in the audience. Any further questions?
I'm Helmut Lubbers, and I'm a realist. I'm an environmental scientist, and I'm a little bit hesitant about what I'm going to say, because I was told today when I came here that I should better shut up, because what I'm going to say the people don't necessarily want to hear. You see, the topic of this, the title of this meeting was, do we need economic growth to achieve more sustainability? Yeah? Now, I'm an avid reader of the Financial Times. And in the Financial Times, it is spelled out over and over again that economic growth is increasing the ecological and environmental problems of this world. There is there was a thing of the United Nations Environmental Programme last year, GO4, and it shows that the Earth is actually becoming smaller because of the growth of the population, but also because of the growth of the use of non-renewable resources. And I would like to challenge Mr. Hausmann. how you could ever believe that ingenuity could revive resources that are non-renewable and recreate them because of economic of intelligence. It's simply not possible. I've got 4 children, and actually this idea was picked up from me because this Earth was this size about 100 years ago. It had this size, and now this planet has about this size. It's small like this, and it's becoming smaller and smaller and smaller. And I've got 4 grandchildren, and I tell you, according to me, it's a no future generation, because everybody who is calling for growth is growing for more destruction. And to Mrs. Burrow, I would like to say that you can say, well, it is irrealistic, but you see, the Earth doesn't care about human realism or dreams. When we are 9 billion people on this planet in 50 years' time, maybe, and if there is climate change, and if we run out of fossil fuels, then society as we know it will collapse. Yeah? And growth will only increase the problem. It will not do anything for sustainability.
You want to say? Okay, Mr. President wants to have the first answer.
I also read the Financial Times from time to time, and I remember a saying of Anglo-Saxon, and I think it is quite correct, at least. The age of stone was not finished because it was a lack of stones, but because we invented a new technology. And I think that it will be the same in the future. We can invent new technology which will avoid that ecological resources will be finished.
Yeah, just a short answer, Mr. Hausmann.
I think that it's thanks to people like you that pose the ecological challenges that science develops and that science tries to address these issues. Malthus wrote in 1820 that the world was going to find limits. The Club of Rome wrote in 1970 that the world was going to have limits. There is always this debate between the optimists and the pessimists, and I say thank God for the pessimists, because they keep us worried and finding solutions. I can tell you that if oil, I come from an oil exporting country, we would like oil to be on demand for the next 150 years, because that's the length of our reserves in oil. But I can tell you that I just had a conversation with a venture capitalist who's investing in biofuels. He says that within 5 years he'll have the technology to produce biofuels at less than $40 a barrel, and that there is enough resources in the world to substitute 100% of the non-renewable oil with biofuels. The world is full of land and water. Let me emphasize this. The world is full of land and water. In my part of the world, it's full of land and water. Water is a local issue. In our part of the world, it rains and it goes. Europe and the US are trying to create biofuels by using their own food grown internally to produce biofuels. If we create a global market for biofuels, biofuels production will take place in the countries that have the land and that have the water to grow it. And we can go to a world without fossil fuels in our lifetime, if the policies are right, and that problem will go away. So there are many things that we can do that has gotten us to this stage in history and that will carry us forward. And that is the message we have to send to our kids, that the world has a future.
But if we depend more on biofuels, let me...
Nonsense. Biofuels is the worst thing that we can do for the environment. You just not informed, Mr. Hausmann.
Well, I don't think we can.
And if you depend more on biofuels, it will have its impact on the food grains. That has already started.
But let's dignify the question. Like, I think we should dignify the question. I understand your concerns for your children and your grandchildren, because I think, okay, but I think we all share them. The thing is, though, the question comes back to us. How seriously can we influence, through democratic countries, the policies of government to heed the concerns that you raise? Because 70% of energy in my country is still based on fossil fuels. I know, as a citizen and a leader in my own country, that we have to do something about that. And every day We try through the unions to advocate the balanced change in the way we do business. Now, you know, the sun is here for all of us. In Nevada, I think they're now using solar thermal to 40% of the base load. We have to make sure that the companies who make all the money off the current destructive practices, we find alternate ways and alternate jobs that actually preserve the future. My only comment about unrealism is a pragmatic one. I don't believe that I, or indeed workers of the world, can change the nature of the capitalist environment unless we have governments in partnership with strong democracies to force the answers to the questions you raise, which are legitimate.
Let me put one point.
Listen, now maybe
Mr.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman.
Okay, we saw your point, but I don't think. No, let's just move over to the next question, please. On the right-hand side, the lady.
Mr. Chairman,
Thank
one
you.
question.
I wanted to ask a question of Mrs. Ndidi Okereke on UK. I'm doing a master's in international development because, as I'm from Nigeria, as you are, I'm very concerned to see that our country develop as it should and that we can address the poverty in Nigeria. And I learned that actually, when you look at the industrial revolution in Europe, it was really a combination of the state and the private sector coming together and coordinating to allow for development and to allow for growth and for development. And then if you even look at the East Asian countries, that's really their story, from South Korea, Taiwan, Japan, pretty much all across the board. But when you answer the question about Nigeria and the state, you said you avoid the state. And that's for the good reason that you explained that the state has a very negative role that it's been playing. My question to you is, what is the effort that the private sector is making to engage the state that it can play a positive role? Because I do not know of any model that is just the private sector that delivers growth and development.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. For the past 10 years that I've been chief executive of the stock exchange, the organized private sector has always engaged government to do what it's supposed to do. But somehow, something happens to people when they go to work for government. They change. I don't know whether it is an African voodoo. I can't tell what it is. But the government behaves differently. Government officials behave differently. We have what we call Nigeria Economic Summit Group. Every single year, we say, okay, the certain number of people from government, certain number of people from the private sector will get together to see how we can have what we call public-private partnership. And we come and talk all the time, give ideas to government, and the role of government to develop the economy. Then what happens? The minute we leave the hall, the government officials behave the way they want to behave. So what we are now trying to do in the private sector is to get and sponsor some people from the private sector to go and work in government. Maybe that will change the attitude of government officials. The American government did that some time ago. It started with the Kennedy administration, and I think it stopped after President Carter, where every year they have this executive exchange program where you have 500 people from the private sector go and work in government offices, and 500 people from government are distributed to private sector, so that the government officials will learn how to work hard and produce, and not to sit down and squander government's money. The money belongs to the people. Another way we think it should be tackled is to educate and enlighten the public. We are digressing here from economic growth, and we are talking about population growth. There's a big difference. What we want to sustain is economic growth, not population growth. The Western world developed because they were able to sustain and not stop completely, but cut down on population growth. That is why India and African countries are suffering because our people have not realized that you were not brought into the world to come and have 20 children. And the resources to cater for 20 children is enormous compared to somebody that has 2 children. So no matter how rich Nigeria becomes, unless we change the attitude, the passion that the government officials have, we will never be able to sustain economic growth. So we are trying to work a partnership, but when they don't listen, we go the other way. And so you have better quality people working in the organized private sector, and it is really the organized private sector that is improving the economy of Nigeria and also the welfare of the people. Until such a time that the government will listen, we are not saying we are stopping completely. We'll continue to educate and enlighten government officials, because we as government is still the human beings, you and I. If I leave the stock exchange today and I go to work for government, I believe I may not change. But what happens is that many people that go there to work, they think that they cannot change anybody, so they join the crowd. And so when we have more people in the organized private sector trying to teach government officials what to do, things will improve. Because there's no reason a country like Nigeria should be poor. We have oil. If you say oil will finish in the next 5 years, we have gas. In fact, gas is making more money now. The liquefied natural gas is making more money now for Nigeria than the oil. So Nigeria has the potential for growth, economic growth. But what we are doing is population growth, which does not augur well for the society. Okay. We do not want to sustain population growth. That is what the gentleman over here is talking about. What we are discussing here is how we can sustain economic growth for the betterment of the people, not population growth.
Next question, please. Is there anybody in the back? There's a gentleman just...
Yes, a number of comments were made about India, and my question is, I would just love to hear what Professor Etty has to say about, in response to what was asked about India.
I would say that the focus of our discussions has changed. What is our concern? The sustenance of growth or sustenance of life and livelihood of the people. These are two different things. And of course, sustenance of the ecology also. If our concern is the sustenance of the life and livelihood of the people, what is needed for people like countries like India is people should have water, people should have land, people should have health, people should have education, people should have dignity of life, people should have protection from the all hazards of growth of big cities. Big cities are causing disastrous consequences on the life of the people. Even in Kerala, the most developed province in India, Kerala was completely protected from malaria till 1991, completely protected, unheard of that. But now it has invaded Kerala. Last year, one epidemic, chikungunya, has invaded Kerala. So all this happens when higher growth rate takes place. So about countries like India, I would say that economic growth is good, that is needed, but that is not the be-all and end-all of life. If our concern is the life and livelihood of the people, its protection and environment, the approach should be different. Too much fascination about growth is misleading the economy, is helping the financial economy to take over the real economy. This is the problem. I think this makes clear.
Thank you very much. Another question in the back. There is a gentleman in the middle row.
I just want to ask
sorry,
which
gentlemen.
side on the world has most possibilities or most power to make good steps, to make next steps for a good development of for the world, for the economy, for the politics. Which sides can really support this process?
Who wants to answer that question?
There is no answer. There is no answer. The countries are so different. The situations are so different. Probably there are some basic rules. Institutions, good institutions, less corruption, free expression of thinking, but it is not enough. I know a country where the press is free, but nobody cares about what the press writes. What does it mean?
What country is that? What country is it?
No, I don't say I want to have
But you're not
friendly
talking
relations with every country in the world.
You're not talking about your home country now.
Well, we listen too much to you. No, institution, free press, free market also, regulations, environmental regulation also, and international cooperation. And when you say that, you start the work.
Okay, next question,
population.
please. No, the gentleman there in the middle. Yeah.
My name is Simon Haferli. I'm a student, and I have a follow-up question for Ms. Okereke to the one the young lady over there asked. Where do you take the confidence in the private sector for, I guess as far as we in Europe are concerned, we pretty much lost confidence that the private sector is so much more honorable than the governments are.
Why do I have the confidence? Because I supervise them, that's why. now seriously, the people, I don't know about other parts of Africa, but I know it's the same in South Africa. The private sector there is very strong and kind of takes the lead. We have come to realize that our governments have failed in Africa. And our governments failed because they have not taken advantage of gender parity, giving opportunities to women to serve alongside men in governments. Because if you have a woman in a society, in a boardroom, and the men are planning to steal money or to appropriate money, the woman may not stop them, but the woman will talk reasonable to them to say, look, this is too much, you are taking too much. If you want to take 100 million, please take 50. Let's use the other 50 for the society. But if you have a boardroom of all men, they decide to take 100 million, they take it. Nobody is there to talk to their conscience. So it's the same thing we are doing in the private sector. We are the conscience of the government. We've come to realize that the governments of Africa are mostly ruled, contained by and propelled by men. And men generally do not think of others. Unlike women, no, it's serious. A woman has a woman. No. Please, this is not, yes, women can clap. The reason is that a woman, just look at your mother and your father, or you and your wife. A woman can do 5 things at a time. A man can only do 1 thing at a time. Okay? If he's reading a newspaper, he reads a newspaper. He doesn't hear the TV. He doesn't have the child crying. Yeah. A woman will sit in the kitchen. She's cooking. She's washing clothes. She's watching TV. She's reading paper all at the same time, and she can hear a child cry. So what we are saying, we women don't want to take over the world. We want to go alongside the men, and we've realized that the governments of Africa are not ready to dilute the numbers of men and bring in some women. Therefore, but the private sector of Africa have realized that they cannot do it alone without women. So they have a mixture of maybe 60% men and 40% women. And that is why the private sector is working and the government is not working. That is what we are trying to teach government. And until they learn, the private sector will continue to move the economy.
Okay.
Also, lastly, please.
Thank you very much.
Not about women.
Sorry.
We have to differentiate economic growth from population growth. I don't have any sympathies for my people when they cry about taking care of people that are poor. Okay? If you decide to have 20 children, you are definitely going to be poor. If you decide to have 2 children, you'll be able to cope. And so what we are doing in Nigeria is to teach our people that for you to go and enjoy life to the fullest and have enough food and water, you can do like Switzerland and other parts of Europe that more or less regulate and enlighten their people to have less children. Then the world will not go to the places, ecological problems of the world will be less. So that is what we have to do in Africa, to teach our people that it is not fashionable for one man to have 20 children, but for one man to have 2 or 3 children, so that there be enough infrastructure to take care of everybody. So I have no sympathies for India or for African people who decide to be having more and more children and then say somebody should give them money to feed those children.
Okay. No, thank you very much. I think we really have to stop because we are already over time. And I thank you very much for these very interesting insights into gender differences. I think we had a very good debate this morning here. I think we did not come up with a real conclusion what kind of growth we want, but I think we all agree that growth is very, very important and that we need growth. And I think the optimistic outview we have on the economy also is a good sign we can take away from this session. I thank you very much for your attention. I thank our panelists very much, and I hope to see you soon again. Thank you very much.